Welcome to ASGCT's ethics webinar today, The Big Picture. Today's topic is accountability in an evolving ecosystem. And I'm thrilled to be moderating the fireside chat today, where we will address topics related to data capture for long-term monitoring for the durability and safety of gene therapy, standardization to enable comparability to facilitate and identify next generation therapies, and the tensions that exist in the evolving landscape. A short Q&A period will follow the panel. You're encouraged to type questions into the Q&A throughout the presentation using the chat tab located along the right-hand side of your webpage. And you may continue to submit questions throughout the Q&A discussions as well. My name is Jodi Wolff. I'm a member of the ASGCT Ethics Committee, and I've worked in biotech for the past decade, leading global patient advocacy activities in rare diseases. I'd like to introduce today's speakers. With me, I have Ryan Fisher, the Chief Operating Officer at Foundation for Angelman Syndrome Therapeutics, or FAST. Andrew McFadden, the ethics lead for Precision Child Health at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto. And John Knighton, the Vice President, API Cell and Gene Development at J&J. So I'd like to start just by offering some thoughts on the topic. We as a field, we recognize that trials collect limited data and that it's often in the post-approval landscape that we have the opportunity to more fully characterize a drug in the expanded population. But what are the obligations of various stakeholders in the long-term safety and efficacy monitoring of individuals who've received gene therapy? And who is incentivized to answer outstanding questions about therapies? Who has the resources to support the long-term monitoring? How is that data captured? How is it made available to stakeholders? There are a lot of questions. I don't know how many answers we're going to have for you today, but we're going to thoroughly discuss all the outstanding topics. There are many stakeholders in this discussion: patients themselves, those who have received a gene therapy and those trying to make a treatment decision based on the existing information, the physicians who treat them, healthcare systems and hospitals, scientists developing new therapies, biotechs bringing therapies to market and those in the commercial landscape now, payers, both public and private, patient advocacy groups, professional organizations, government research funders like the NIH, and probably more that are not top of mind right now. The ecosystem here is vast. So the first question that I'd like to propose to our panel is just centering it back on the patients and those who are receiving gene therapy. What is our moral obligation to the patients receiving a one-time gene therapy in the long term, and a therapy that can't be undone?
I'm happy to start. As someone who's worked in patient advocacy now for 2 decades, I think our first obligation is for them to have as much information as possible in order to make such a decision. You know, in many conditions, the families not only receive a catastrophic diagnosis, but often are presented in that time period with making these really tough decisions. And I think we owe it to them to provide them with what's out there in a clear way so that they can make that benefit risk determination. And they're really weighing everything they've learned and know about the condition, about the symptoms, about the lifespan. All of that is weighed against what they're being presented on benefits and risks and uncertainties for a potential therapy. And I think without that information and a clear way of explaining to them, it's hard for them to make such a determination.
And yeah, I mean, I agree, Ryan. And obviously, especially in today's day and age where you and I 20 years ago, 15 years ago, never would have thought that there would be almost different choices for patients and patient advocacy groups and parents, et cetera, to make. You know, you diagnosed and you may be rolled into an enzyme replacement therapy or some type of treatment that existed, or more often than not, you didn't. And now there's multiple, you know, there can be an enzyme replacement frontline therapy, gene therapy, having just been approved, or 3 or 4 that are in clinical trial and developing in clinical trials. And patients and families have to make, in terms of gene therapies, that one important decision about which sort of, approved therapy or a clinical trial that they're going to enroll in. And so that transparency and all of that information is vital for those patients and families and physicians and the rest of the people involved to make those decisions. At the same time, I think that we have a duty to the patients and their families who've already been dosed to continue to provide them with all of the information that they could possibly have over time. We're not talking like monthly, every 6 months for a couple of years. We're talking like 10, 15 years, because as we start to, learn more and more about what these gene therapies can and can't do to the body, is it, potential to redose, or there long-term safety adverse events that we may be, need to know about. And so that obligation, that moral obligation, as you said, Jodi, to make sure that there's that follow-up is vitally important. It all comes down to transparency from all stakeholders involved.
Can you speak a little bit about?
I agree. If I can add in, go ahead, Jodi.
Oh no, go right ahead, John.
No, I was just going to add in that I agree with Ryan and Andrew and Jodi's view, what you had positioned it. I think there's a moral, there's also a regulatory obligation by the sponsors in terms of follow-up for the patients. And we'll touch on how we might be able to change that to make it a little bit easier for the patient as well as the sponsors in the long term. But, to make sure first and foremost that it's safe, right? That we're getting the right information out there about potential AEs. Also, the physician and the patient ultimately need to make that call along with their families, right? Do they take the treatment or not? To your point, Ryan, there's a lot of information out there. J&J, as well as some other industry partners, put out in clinicaltrials.gov, right? Information about trials that are ongoing, so that there's more information of what treatments may be coming and what may be beneficial for those patients. Of course, there's approved labels and the efficacy with that, and that's where that discussion with the patient comes in, and then understanding that real world evidence as it's out there on the market as that continues to grow. I think all plays into decision making.
And I want to touch on that real world evidence piece, because I think that's vitally important. We need to be updating what we know about these treatments and these drugs, not just for patients and families, but for regulators as well, for payers as well, to maybe change start-stop criteria as we learn more about what these drugs or treatments do. Right now in Canada, there's a very public case going on about a little girl who's been taken off a therapy based on, from what I can see, older start-stop criteria that hadn't been updated to really reflect what we now know about the efficacy and the beneficial aspects of this drug. And so if you were to sort of look at that older, start-stop, perhaps at this stage that patient should come off. But as we learn more about drugs and treatments, as our knowledge evolves, so too should the criteria that we use to either start a patient or stop a patient. I mean, we'd do this if there was a serious adverse safety event that we found out about after 2 years or 3 years. We'd immediately update the label. We'd immediately, sometimes pull it from the market. We'd make sure that patients were as safe as they possibly could be. And we need to be doing this as well as we learn more about beneficial, positive aspects of these drugs, so that we ensure that the right patients are able to access these innovative medicines as much as possible. Mm-hmm. I heard a dog back there, Jodi.
Yeah.
Friends are always dropping in.
Real-time distractions here. So if you can tell me a little bit about what data do you think is necessary?
Discussion's under the dogs already.
It usually does with us.
What data, he's going to make an appearance now.
Perfect.
So what data is necessary, do you think, to further characterize products post-approval? When you say transparency of data and as much data as possible, what kind of data are we talking about? And can we reflect a little bit on how different groups might be incentivized differently to provide such transparency of data?
Yeah, I think that when it comes to the original patients from these studies, who have been on a one-time treatment like a gene therapy the longest, that data, long-term data, is so important for those for when it gets approved. So it speaks to safety, it speaks to durability, which we know there's questions of durability for some of these gene therapies. So, I mean, I think that type of information, it's difficult though, because, you know, say that data is locked up, or when does it actually get released? Because the clinicians who are talking to these patients, who they rely on to have that information to help them make an informed decision in a shared decision-making construct. If they don't have that, you're not giving everything to the patient to make the best possible decision for their loved one. So certainly safety, durability come to mind right away.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And I love that you touched on those patients that were sort of first infused. And some people on the call may know that my son was one of those original patients in a gene therapy trial, infused, we're looking at, which is hard to believe, almost 7 years ago now. And so his data on not only efficacy, but long-term safety, durability, et cetera, is vitally important for the next patients that are going into this phase of the clinical trial. And when that drug, if and when that gene therapy gets approved, how are we going to be able to capture sort of those participants that were in the trial to help inform new patients, new families, et cetera, unless we do have this veil of secrecy or transparency sort of lifted? Who owns that data? Who's responsible for sharing it? I know that even my son's own physicians right now don't get regular updates from the trial site about the follow-up that takes place. His is in Italy, so we travel over to Italy once or twice a year, et cetera, and we do this follow-up. There isn't much that goes back to his regular providers at home. So even that sort of ability to share data is difficult. I can't imagine in a post-approval landscape how you would get still ongoing follow-up safety data from clinical trial participants out into the public domain for patients, families, and healthcare providers to make decisions.
Yeah, I think part of it is data standardization and collection, to your point, so that it can be collected in a way easily and then distributed to the patients as well as the physicians to understand, and those that have been treated as well as those who might be considering treatment, right? So they have better clarity of where this is going. I think a lot of it is standardization. We're still sort of evolving this. There's multiple stakeholders involved, right? In that data collection and standardization. The durability, at least from a sponsor standpoint, we love to publish the durability and as the trials go out, to share and move up on the indications, because that shows that the drug is working. And if there's an issue, obviously we do the same thing. If there's a problem, we do transparently communicate that from a sponsor's view. But I think data collection in general and standardization will help to show that more real time, rather than waiting till an endpoint or there's a safety concern that needs to be broadcasted.
How do you ensure that it's the burden on collecting that data to the family itself, right? It's the amount of data you're asking for, number of visits, to Andrew's point, flying over to Italy. And thank you for doing that for the field. It's so important. But I think it's something to consider is, do you worry about, do they return, right? And do we have all of the information?
Yeah, I mean, this idea of return is really interesting, and we're grappling with that within our own family. Listen, for years, 20 years, I was in patient advocacy. We really promoted gene therapy, evolution of science, participation in trial, how to do it safely, et cetera. We funded millions of dollars in research projects. The project that we're involved with now, we were some of the original funders for. And then, finally, you get over that, you move your family to Italy, you participate. Very, very lucky that Isaac was able to participate. He signed on he signed his own informed consent, at the age of 14. Obviously we were there and we signed as well, but over time, he's now 18 and now he's 20 and he's signing his own like updated informed consents and that sort of thing. And when it comes time to follow up, he's looking at me and like, Dad, I mean, I just don't want to go to Italy. Like, who says they don't want to go to Italy? Dad, I just don't want to go. Like, why do I have to go to Italy and do a 6-minute walk test when I can go to Toronto and do the exact same thing? Why do I have to fly over there? Why do I have to like take time out of my life? And he gets to make that decision at this age. And obviously we work with him to help make as informed a decision as he possibly can. But that ability to follow through long term, that is a burden. Flying to Italy is a burden. And I know, Ryan, you and I wrote a piece a couple of years ago about decentralization of these types of trials and a follow-up and that sort of thing. That's how we can sort of help reduce that burden, but it is an incredible burden long time for these patients and families.
Yeah, those are all excellent points.
And I think right now with yeah, if I could add in, if I may, we're trying to make it simpler for the patient follow-up, right? I think, but the 15-year requirement in some cases, like for the CAR-Ts, where does that stop? And we're going to touch, I think, on policy changes in the future, but we need to look at it. I think Emily Whitehead Foundation did a survey in the fall, right? And 38% or more was like, I'm probably not going to be coming back after a few years, right? I have the drug, it's looking good, and they'll just drop off. So we need to make this one simpler, but we need to follow up and have enough information that, and thank you, Andrew, for your son's diligence on this, because it does play into understanding, is the drug safe for others, right? So there's a balance, right? We need to make sure we have enough data to feel supportive. We're not making an undue burden on the patients. We also have to talk about, when's the time to sort of draw the line? Do we really need to follow every single patient and we get to tens of thousands of patients potentially with potential with like CAR-Ts or certain things, right? So where is enough information to feel comfortable? And then it's just routine monitoring.
That point you made about, learning for other patients. I think for our family, for Isaac, that's the biggest sort of selling feature of continued follow-up for him, because he participated in a trial almost for very altruistic purposes. And he talked about his feeling that he wanted to learn whether a drug, whether the gene therapy worked, not just for him, but for others out there, so that they didn't have to sort of go down a wrong path. But if it did work, then he could be a part of that. And I think that idea of making sure that we're still looking, altruistically at the entirety of the patient population with these follow-ups is very helpful, because you're right. He will look and say, I'm doing fine. I feel great. My blood work comes back awesome. Why do I have to continue to do, a walk test? And I do 1,000 walk tests for just normal follow-up anyway. Why do I have to fly to Italy to do it? But that idea, that altruism idea of making sure that we can ensure long-term safety for the patients that follow is important. And for Isaac, it's something that he wants to continue to do because of that.
One thing I wonder is, we're talking a lot about, in the evolving ecosystem of when gene therapies become commercial products, but what about programs that don't move forward? There are plenty of gene therapy programs that get discontinued, or ownership might change hands of programs. Programs get bought and sold. And some refer to this as like failed trials, or when a program gets shelved or something like this. But what's our obligation there? Who follows up?
Well, at the moment, we've had this conversation before, Ryan and I, about how this is one of the things I'm most afraid of, is that these smaller companies or investigator, research-led trials run out of money, or they shut down, or they, results look, okay, but there's no path to, probably there's a path to approval, but no path to appropriate reimbursement, or the criteria is going to be so stringent that a fraction of the already rare population are the only people that's going to be able to see benefit. And so those programs that do get shut down for whatever reason, who is going to be responsible for that follow-up? You see it at larger pharmaceutical companies and small companies alike, that once that program sort of gets shelved, that team moves on to other projects. They're all, sort of filtered out into, the next big thing or something else. And even sort of like that contact that you always had in place in order to help set up follow-up appointments, et cetera, would get lost. And that's in the very, first few months and years post shelving of a trial or post failed trial or whatever, words we're going to use. What happens at that 8-10 year mark when perhaps, efficacy is taking a dip, that durability is no longer there? How do we know when patients that may have been on an enzyme replacement therapy and then received a gene therapy need to go back on enzyme replacement therapy because sort of, I don't know, ARSB levels or whatever is dipping in the blood? We need to have some sort of industry-wide, all partners coming together to make policies of what that follow-up looks like. Who is responsible? Will it go back to primary care physician? Who pays for it? Foot the bill. It's a big fear.
Often some data is sitting in patient registries, and I'm not saying that's the complete answer for that. I also don't think patient registries should be recording safety events, but they may be recording what's happening from a field's functions, survives, whatever it may be. And then other data might be sitting in hospital records that isn't consolidated or brought together. So I think we have to think about where the data exists and how to do it responsibly.
Yeah, those registries right now, still sort of messy, right? Like there might be 5 MPS registries that are out there and haven't been talked to each other. They're not consolidated. Whose data is going where? How can it be used? We need to really tighten up these registries and really make sure that there's funding in place to help ensure that these registries are not only tightened up and cohesive and can share data, et cetera, but that they can be long-term and they can sustain themselves over time instead of drop off after whatever year the FDA or Health Canada says a pharmaceutical company needs to sort of keep up with them post-approval.
John, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I think there is. Yeah, I just wanted to comment on that. There is, obviously as a sponsor of clinical trials, we have a responsibility to follow up on our patients, and we do so, to your point, Andrew. And we follow up for years, to be honest, in some cases. It's not like trial doesn't work and we just drop, right? So that obviously if the company goes bankrupt and is dissolved, that's a different challenge. But in terms of companies that are ongoing concerns, there's a moral obligation and there's a regulatory obligation for our patients, whether the trial works or not, to follow up on those patients, and we do so for years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Joe, this also brings to mind those trials that are doing different dosing, low dose versus high dose, and those families that are put on a low dose and it may not be as effective. I think that families need to be aware of sort of the potential risks and uncertainties related to that. But, what's our responsibility to them later on? I think people throw around redosing as a quick and easy thing. We all know the reality of that is not the truth. But this is just, yeah, go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, you're right. The reality of it is not the truth. We hope, of course. But, if you were in a low dose trial and it sort of, low dose portion of a trial, that drug goes on to be approved, are you going to be able to go back to the company once redosing does become reality to say, hey, I think, thinking about reciprocity, et cetera, my participation in a trial, we should have access to sort of the first redosing, or you have a moral obligation to ensure that we can, be topped up to whatever efficacious dose that we have. And that requires a whole lot of advocacy, a whole lot of pushing. I don't think you're going to see many trial sponsors, jumping to the front of the line to say, yes, we're going to provide you with more free dose or re-enroll you in another clinical trial, et cetera. It's a question that I think that is on top of mind of all of those patients and families that are in receive sort of half dose or lower dose. But it should be something that we consider moving forward as part of maybe an informed consent to say that if and when something, comes around that we can redose, we will work with you and your family to provide or to help gain access or cost share with government or anything like that, or payers around the world to make sure that it can happen, because it is something that we should keep front and center for us.
That's an interesting thought. I mean, when I think about the moral obligation we have to
redose,
that's really interesting about.
Yeah, there's a moral obligation.
Go ahead, John. I think there's a lag.
Yeah, I think there is.
Yeah, there seems to be a bit of a lag. So I was going to say, there's obviously a moral obligation, and every patient that are enrolled in any of the trials, we hope that the dose, whatever it is, it works, right? We don't know. Redose, I think, is something that in some cases, no, it doesn't work. I hate to be frank, right? So in some cases, there is a risk. And it's going to have to then be judged, do we have enough information to know if redose would even work? Is there a safety concern? But there is information out there that says redosing isn't effective, right? And for various reasons. So I think it's case by case and an understanding. Obviously, if the patient can benefit from a redose, I think that's something that absolutely has to be first and foremost in our minds, and always is as our patients, and how we can improve a lot.
Mm-hmm.
John, I want to go back to you, because you had talked about the obligation of the companies and that they fulfill that obligation to monitor patients long term. But we also heard from Ryan talking about how the patients need as much data as possible. And we know that the companies are collecting or mandated to collect a subset of information. And maybe there's some discrepancies or some tensions between what the patients want and need and what the companies are collecting. How do we fill in those gaps?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think continued conversations with obviously the patient advocacy groups, right? What's lacking or may be lacking, and how we can continue to grow as this field continues to grow. What information is the patient not seeing that they feel they need? Also, in terms of what's being collected, is it, as we talked about earlier, is it collected in a way that can be standardized and quickly distributed? And then as we look even ahead, is, as we talked about, is how do we make this even easier for the patients to get data collected in a simpler fashion so that we can have as much information as possible to share, right? So I think this is an ongoing, and the forums like this, I think, are helpful to start those discussions and continue those discussions as this field grows.
Can we talk a little bit about who bears the costs and who has the resources to create the data infrastructure in a post-commercial landscape? Can we share some thoughts? Ryan, you talked about patient registries. John, you talk about industry. And Andrew, you mentioned the clinical records. How do we get this all together? How do these, and John, maybe this is standardization, that all these things can talk to each other, but that seems like a really heavy lift after a drug has gotten approved and the incentives change to collect this massive amount of data. And sometimes companies are restricted in what they can and can't share and what they can and can't say in a post-approval landscape. So can we just talk about just everyone has a little bit of infrastructure and none of it's talking to each other, but how do we invest in this area? If anyone wants to get
it's so hard. Go ahead, Ryan, because I know.
I mean, I think
that's a huge question.
From a patient advocacy perspective, I think we sit in a very unique position in the broader drug development ecosystem. Okay, we are often talking to all of these actors and folks within that ecosystem, and they are ultimately decision makers that impact the lives of our patients. Right? They all need information in order to make decisions and to do what they need to do. But I think that's the unique nature where patient advocacy needs to own our power.
Yes.
As we are there at the center to bring these folks in a collaborative way. And I think often we do it after the fact, and it's too late for us to agree upon standardization, agree upon what matters most, what outcome measures could be used. And I think it has to happen even earlier in the process. It's a delicate balance because before you have that first approval, you're thinking we just need to do everything we can to get this over the line. However, I think thinking ahead is the lessons we learned in Duchenne and where I'm bringing to the Angelman syndrome community is let's get ahead of this and bring those stakeholders together, clinicians, regulators, companies, patient advocacy, payers, if you can, to have a frank conversation about where we go from here, and can we actually agree upon a core data set? Can we, what can we do to move the ball forward, and who does what?
And collaboration between patient groups as well. I mean, we often see that the smaller patient advocacy organizations, the mom and pop ones, much like mine, began way back when it was just my wife and I sort of flipping burgers and making $40 on a weekend to fund research. Those types of organizations also need to be brought into these conversations as well, because quite often it's the national bodies that are given a priority of voice, and for and obviously because they're larger bodies and they represent a larger amount of people, but they don't represent all of the patients or all the patient voices. And collaboration to bring everybody together in order to move forward together on where this data is going to go, what outcome measures are going to be used, et cetera, is vitally important for this to take place. But for all of it to take place, the money needs to be there. I mean, we'd be funding, working our tails off to fund one research project back in the day. And then you go from that one to the next one, you get bigger and bigger, and your money really gets, streamlined to ensuring that research can be lifted off the ground so that patients can access it. And then after approval, do you shift your priorities to making sure that registries, et cetera, or collaboration is front and center, or do you look toward funding other research opportunities that maybe the rest of the patient population, can benefit from, adjunct therapies for bones and joints and that sort of thing? And so not only does there need to be collaboration about voices and prioritizing all voices so that everybody's heard, but there needs to be, shared resources to make sure that this can be lifted off the ground. And that includes with our, pharmaceutical partners helping out in ways that are transparent, but and above board, and not sort of an inducement to move forward, but to make sure that the data is there that we can all share and learn and benefit from.
And since the title,
I think data standardization is key. I think.
Go ahead, John.
Go ahead, Jodi. Sorry, I'm in the office. There must be a lag here in Pennsylvania.
I know. We
Go ahead.
It's but no, so I was just going to say that there's data that's being collected in different forms for different reasons, right? Obviously, there's regulatory obligations, there's moral obligations. In the end, standardization of that data and the transparency of that data, everybody wins, right? So I think that's what we're saying and what we're agreeing upon. Obviously, the sponsor has a certain obligation, and not only morally, but also regulatory wise, right, to watch their product. Sharing that information, though, the patients and the patient advocacy groups can build up the knowledge base and also guide patients where to go based upon some of that data, right? So I think across the board, the data standardization and transparency, I think will benefit everybody from different views of how we can benefit our patients.
So, John, since the title of this is the big picture, accountability in an evolving ecosystem, how do we hold these various players accountable for not just coming to the table, but contributing and being good partners?
Sorry, Jodi, I missed that question.
No worries. And Ryan and Andrew can jump in here as well. I was just saying that as far as accountability, how do we hold all these various stakeholders accountable for not just getting to the table and being good partners, but contributing data and you know, being good partners in this endeavor?
I think, again, forums like this allow that conversation to start. There are resources that are going to be required, right? And that's where it's going to have to come from the different stakeholders to talk through how's best to fund, right? And what does that look like? What's already being done that can be maybe modified without adding cost or burden to the system, which we don't want to do, right? We don't want to add more burden to the patients. We don't want to add more burden to the sponsors or even to the governments if we're already collecting it in a way that can be standardized and transparent to allow these conversations, right? And I think information's being collected, and also patient information. How do we continue to standardize this in a way that everybody wins without any burden and actually maybe even make it streamlined?
Yeah, I think that, you know, from perspective of like somebody like me working in an institution, we need to continue to sort of share our expertise and publish papers, and not only just sort of a singular voice, you know, Andrew McFadden, you know, is publishing something, but working, you know, Ryan and I publish a lot together, working with patient advocacy groups. We always typically have somebody from industry that's participating on our papers as well. So that shared perspective and that shared knowledge can be advanced forward. I also think, and Ryan touched on this, the power of the patient advocacy organization and the patient advocacy voices. We've seen that evolution over the last 20 years, helping to advance science, helping to advance equitable access in trials, helping to advance reimbursement of drugs, et cetera. And I think now that voice and that really unique role that they play, collaborating with all of the other voices around the table, needs to be front and center in something like this, to make sure that the accountability lies with all of us together rather than just one entity over another.
Yeah. And I mean, I think the flip side for patient advocacy is often all those stakeholders are pointing to us and blaming all the other stakeholders.
Yes.
And they're saying, you yell at the payers,
Yes.
yell at this company.
I know.
You should be telling the clinicians to do this. And it's sort of unfair, but it is our responsibility to continue to bring these folks together, have them talk to each other, do as much as we can pre-competitively,
Yes.
And recognize everybody's roles may be different. Their needs may be different in order to have information to then do what they need to do. But, you know, I think it can often be tricky for a patient advocacy group, but that act of convening where everyone's in the same room talking about these things and what our expectations are, and, you know, not necessarily naming and shaming folks, but putting examples of good and bad practices and then keeping to that. And I will say the patient advocacy groups are held accountable by the patients themselves, who will call you out, understandably and rightfully so, about where they see these needs. So, and when it comes to monitoring what's happening for outcomes for these families, guess what? The information may just appear on social media first. And that, I think, is worrisome when they're reporting to other families, well, this is what I'm seeing and experiencing as an N of one. And I'm not trying to silence that voice, but I think it needs to be supported by actual data that can be presented so these families can make the best choices for their loved ones.
Well, imagine being a part of an ecosystem now, Ryan, where the patient advocacy group is the center of all of those people sort of coming to you and I know for years that that's the way it was. Go talk to that payer, tell them that we're giving them the best deal already, or, we're going to yank access to drug, or have the payer say, we'll go back to them and say that, our health system or something like that. Yeah, I'm in Canada, so we're publicly funded system. Tell them that we can't afford that, and that longevity of our health system means that they need to, cut back on pricing now to support patients in the future. That is obviously some of the negatives of being sort of that central figure, but being that central figure now means that your voice is ever more important to ensure that that collaboration takes place. It is a lofty responsibility for sure, and I'm glad that you recognize that and really stated it. But it's also something that we can use to move forward and harness together as we're getting into more and more approvals at the FDA level, more and more highly expensive drugs. How do we look at what role do we play in sort of value-based outcomes for these gene therapies, et cetera? All of that comes into play as a central figure of a patient advocacy organization.
I do.
There are certain centers.
Go ahead, John.
Go ahead, John.
No,
I was just going to say, I
delay. In case he says something, they're going to buzz him out at J&J.
Yeah. So I mean, like on the cell side, right? We already have like the Center for International Blood and Marrow Transplant Research, right? That's collecting a lot of data, and it's a hard database to mine, but that's a great place to start, at least on the cell therapies, right? Where a lot of information is flowing in. We continue to standardize and get information out, right? So over to you, Jodi.
I did want to circle back to standardization, because we do have a question in the chat about it, but it was actually a question that I had planned to ask you. Can you comment on standardization of reporting across trials and across products so that patients and researchers can interpret results for decision making? This is a huge issue. We have multiple products in various areas, which is a great problem to have for a particular indication, for patients to have choice. But can you talk a little bit about standardization, like how patients make decision making when all of these gene therapies might be reporting differently results?
John, do you want to hit that first?
Yeah, I'll start and look to my colleagues to chime in. I think, in terms of data, right, and different products out there, it ultimately is up to the physician and the patient to choose, right? While it's in clinical trials, there's clinicaltrials.gov. A lot of the companies are participating. It is voluntary, but J&J is one of them, where you can see the data as it's coming in and it's being published, and then they can have that conversation. Once it's commercially approved, there's an approved label and the efficacy, then at least that information is shared and published. But and also we talked a little bit about the real world evidence, right? As that's coming in, to have that information shared, and that builds into the how patient advocacy groups and the physician, right, end up making that call together with that patient to say, all right, this is a collection of data. Here's the products out there with the approved labels. Here's the information we have. Let's sit down and talk about it. So that's sort of my view. Andrew, maybe you have some thoughts, or Ryan.
Well, I mean, I think for me, I think the key term of within that standardization idea is also meaningful. I mean, it has to be meaningful data that we're collecting, and meaningful is different for every drug, every disease, every sort of gene therapy that's out there. I know, and I've shared this story before, and Isaac told me I can continue to share it, far and wide. I remember Isaac, who'd been involved in this research ecosystem for a long time, as he was about to sort of embark on that baseline 6-minute walk test, 14 years old, about to start. Do you have any questions? And he says, just looks at the research and says, do you want me to mail this one in so the data looks great post infusion? Right? I mean, that's these are things that the 6-minute walk test, I think it's an old, outdated measure that we're still using for a lot of these drugs to move forward. It's not as meaningful as some of the other outcome measures that you might, be able to work with a patient advocacy group and a group of patients and family members, et cetera, to decide. And I think that's how we need to be moving forward, is thinking about what meaningful means and how do we share what that meaningful data is for other patients and families to understand. I've sat with payers before and looking at enzyme replacement therapies, and I've had, ministers of health say to me, well, big deal, Bobby can walk an extra 40 meters. Tell me how that, equates to $1 million per year from public coffers to pay for. And what they don't understand is that 40 meters is much more than sort of that walk. It's shows the ability to be able to maybe go from the house to their own car or to their own work, to not need help to use the bathroom at school. And that is where that sort of meaningful word comes from in an outcome measure like that. So I think if we're talking standardization, I would love to see, it's very difficult to do because there's different drugs, different diseases, different outcomes that matter to patients and families. But if we can talk standardization, I think we also need to talk meaningful standardization, so that really that's the information that's out there being used.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think if folks asked the Duchenne community earlier on about the 6-minute walk test and what they felt about what a difference of 30 meters actually means at the end of the day, right? There's a big difference between MCID, minimal clinical important difference, and what's actually meaning to your day-to-day when it comes to meaningfulness. But the truth is, it's hard in rare disease. You are learning as you go. Natural history is to help you better characterize the disease, and you don't make the perfect choices early on. And I think it sort of matures over time. But it's work that you have to do. It's not work that's sexy to sell to the community that we're funding natural history, but it's critical. And you have to adapt and understand how these measures then translate to the day-to-day life of these families and patients. And it should change and evolve over time. And you hope to get to a place where you have a core outcome set that's acceptable to all of those decision makers within the ecosystem. And hopefully it's not heavily burdensome on patients. Hopefully for those registries that exist, there are PROs and other reportable outcome measures that can be included and is also collected through natural history. I think we have to get away from everything but the kitchen sink in these trials and get more towards what is actionable and what is meaningful at the end of the day, to really characterize these conditions and whether or not a drug is working.
We need other partners to believe in that sort of natural history data as well, though, right? Like we need those payers to understand that, we know that these patients and families are having 100 seizures a day prior to an infusion, and now they're not having any. And for them to sort of come back to say, well, show me the data on how it reverses, or controls seizures. You're just like, these patients and families live it every day. Like we know this information. And so having that buy-in from everybody on that natural history is important for sure as well.
Mm-hmm.
So as we're in our last 10 minutes, I just want to encourage everyone online now to enter questions into the chat for the panel, and we'll be happy to entertain those. One way I want to end is just thinking about the policy implications related to our discussion, and who needs to be at the table. Like, what are the policy implications? What can we do here to start moving some of this conversation forward? John, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, thanks, Jodi. I think sort of in my mind, it's three things. There's absolutely opportunities to change policy here, right? For better. First off, I think we talked on about it, patient follow-up, right? What that looks like in the long term, how to make it easier for our patients. What's required? Is it every single patient post-market that needs to be followed? How we can improve that. That's one. Accelerated approvals, to be honest, right? As we're looking to move especially in some of these trials for cancers, trying to move them up the indication, how can we do it sooner so patients can get the drugs earlier, right? Rather than have a long drawn out durability and statistical analysis of this. And also then, are there other flex payment type models that may be available, right? In terms of outcome based, to get the payers more involved and more accessible, to Andrew's point, right? Of, how can we make this more accessible for patients and more real for the benefit? So I think there's a lot of opportunity here. So I'll stop there.
Ryan, and maybe you can jump in, being from a patient advocacy group, about how you think about some of the policy implications of answering and moving forward some answers to these questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that patient-focused drug development can't just be a bumper sticker here. We work to advocate so that we are incorporating the views of families into everything from the design of these, trials, as well as moving through past approval. We need to get into the post-approval space when it comes to this, listening to patients, how they think and feel. There are ways to quantify these things through surveying. I think we have to better understand going in tolerance for benefit, risk, and uncertainty of patient populations in order to really better move these things forward and inform the ecosystem. I think everything that John said is quite appropriate here. I think that, as we move forward, really, as I've said repeatedly, and we're doing this in the Angelman syndrome, of course, is to bring together all those relevant stakeholders as much as possible and get on the same page and have patients and families be the center of those conversations.
Andrew, why don't you go ahead and round us out here with your thoughts?
Well, I mean, obviously, John and Ryan have hit it home, but I do, from an institutional perspective, we need to be sort of at the forefront of evolving some of these, the way that we are running these trials. I know we've just got a paper out now at Sick Kids, and Pat Furlong was part of that paper as well, envisioning a new model for a new conceptual model of where N of 1 treatments lie on the research care continuum. And that's vitally important because it really dictates what that relationship between researchers and patients and families look like, how, what type of data is being collected, what the expectations are, what type of regulatory pathways we're moving forward to. And I think that being sort of at the forefront of thinking through what some of these complex issues might be, and pitching new models or working collaboratively to hone in on a better model for what some of these trials and especially these N of 1 type trials can be is really, really important. And again, that sort of loops back to making sure that we're including patients in the evolution of what these models look like. It's including patient advocacy groups, our industry partners, our payers, et cetera, in that collaborative model, that collaborative framework, and then putting it out there to sort of pressure test it. It just came out last week, and we've already received lots of very informative feedback to help us sort of change that model or evolve that model and put it in front of regulatory agencies to say, this is what we're pitching. How do you see that fitting in with your new guidelines moving forward, et cetera? So from our side of things, where I sit now in an institution, that's where I think I can help most.
Great. So I think we've heard a lot of things today as far as in solving for or addressing some of these big picture issues in the post-gene therapy, post-approval landscape for gene and cell therapies, that the patients continue to be at the center of this ecosystem. And when they're not, we start to really see that in these tensions between all the various players and the data that we need versus the data that we have, and the infrastructure and payer policies and many different things. Ryan, I like how you said that we need to evolve patient-focused drug development to the post-approval landscape. and that is the next frontier. Like, it doesn't end with just getting the drug approved. And that as we gain in knowledge, the risk benefit for our patients continues to evolve and change. And we, as a field, as various stakeholders, need to facilitate that in whatever way possible. And this takes collaborations, it takes investment, it takes transparency. And so I just want to thank ASGCT for letting us wrestle with some of these big picture issues today, and who's accountable for this post-approval landscape, and for the gaining of knowledge beyond what we know when a drug gets approved. And I just want to open it for my panelists. Any last thoughts as we go on with our day?
I'll just chime in that we've talked a lot about, making sure patients and patient groups are at the center, but I think we also have to do a good job of ensuring that voice has diversity. Often some of these groups reach sort of a subset of their communities, and we have to make sure that there's diversity in the voice of patients that are often harder to reach, so that we can have the full picture to inform what we're doing. And we can never forget that.
And I'll echo that, and I'll echo Josh, who in our chat is talking about how frustrating it is when there's some cynical, voices around payers' table talking about that walk test. That idea of all of the things that you can do is vitally important. And hearing stories like what Josh has put in the chat is our job to make sure that it gets elevated and patients are empowered through that collaboration that Ryan is talking about. So I appreciate forums like this. I appreciate sort of, being able to move to a new role, but still speak with old friends and get our messages out. So thanks everybody. And thanks Josh for putting that through. You're bang on.
Yeah, and if I can just read Josh's comment real quick. This is from Joshua Thayer. He says that it's frustrating to hear about the cynical reaction to increase walking distance. As a patient with limb-girdle muscular dystrophy, who's also an advocate, I can say that being able to dress, bathe, brush our hair, transfer, or even halt further progression is clinically meaningful, and that we need clinical outcome assessments that are more nuanced. As you say, they don't stand in isolation, but are also indicative of our condition more broadly. And we don't expect a miracle and shouldn't have to. So
beautifully said. The walk test should be changed to the impact that it has on endurance and lifestyle and all of that. That's what Josh is really hitting home there.
Yeah. Go ahead, John, and I'll wrap us up.
No, thank you. And, first and foremost, I think we're all here for our patients, and in some cases our family members, right? Wanting to do the right thing. We're learning. This is not easy science, easy technology, but the benefits are huge and in some cases variable. But we need to say, to the point like Josh is saying here in this text or in his write-up, right? The benefit, it can be huge. Even if it doesn't look like it's a cure, it's a step forward, and that's huge for those patients. So in the end, that's what we're trying to do. And I'm happy to be part of this panel, so thank you.
Great, thank you. And thank you all for attending this session of the ASGCT Ethics webinar. Thanks to our panelists for sharing their expertise and for the great discussion. This event was recorded. It'll be available on demand on ASGCT's website. With our annual meeting approaching, I want to take the opportunity to invite you all to join our trainee networking event, which will be held at ASGCT Central on Thursday, May 15th during the annual meeting. You can find more information by clicking on the related content tab on the right-hand side of your screen. ASGCT values your feedback and welcomes suggestions for our future sessions. So please take a moment to complete the evaluation form linked in the chat or the QR code on the screen. Thank you so much for joining us today.